Okay, so today we're going to go over Surah 96, and it is entitled Al-Alaq, the Clot or the clinging thing. And it's also called sometimes Surah Ikra, which means read, roughly translates to read. And this is one of the sticking points of Muhammad's historiography, the idea that he was illiterate or couldn't read, and Muslims often invoke this to justify their belief in the Quran as some sort of divinely created book. The fact that Muhammad was unable to read, and how could someone who was unable to read be able to compile these lengthy surahs, hi GW, and that are so that impart such wisdom. And of course, for someone who's actually read the Quran, you realize that it's not it's one of the most tedious, stupid books ever composed. And not to mention one of the most logically inconsistent and incoherent books that you'll ever find, at least of this length. So, but they use the fact that he was supposedly illiterate in order to justify this. Now he didn't write down the Quran. It wasn't him that actually composed it. The Quran itself was composed well after his death by his followers. Hi, Corrance. Hi, Miss Piggy. Um, glad you tuned in. But so it was composed long after his death. But the fact that Muhammad was the one who inspired this collection of wisdom, according to Muslims, and he was illiterate, that's proof that it's divinely created, that it's somehow the work of Allah. But of course, there are also disputes about this, the meaning of unlettered. Some people say it could just refer to the culture. Now, Arabia was a pre-literate culture. This is why oral tradition was so important. Just like we have the Odyssey was told through oral tradition, and you have African mythologies that were told through griots. Arabia did not have a literate culture before predating Islam, so it was mostly things that were told orally, passed down. And this is one of the reasons Muslims put such an emphasis on being a hafiz, or being able to recite the Quran verbatim. To them, this is a sign that the Quran is beyond any other book. The fact that people can memorize it and recite it by rote. Now, of course, this isn't really significant. You could do this with virtually any book if you studied it long enough. You would be able to recite certain passages. It doesn't necessarily mean you have an understanding of the content of the book. And this is the problem with Muslims. I remember an incident during the David Wood Muhammad hijab debate where there was a little Muslim boy he couldn't have been older than 6, and pointed out this fact that he could remember huge passages from the Quran, and he had already memorized it despite being so young. And his point was that makes Islam better because Christians don't remember it. First of all, there are Christians that have a very intense, very expansive knowledge of the content of the Bible. They can memorize long verses. In fact, I go to a Bible church where there are many people that can recite um, uh, many passages from the Bible by memory. But the problem is with Islam, these people do not understand the meaning of the words, mostly because they don't. Arabic is not their native language for the most part. If you're a Muslim today, less than 20% of the Muslims would actually understand Arabic, much less the classical Arabic in which the Quran was written. It's not the same. It's not really the same type of language, just like the Koine Greek in which the New Testament written is not the same Greek that you would read if you read a Greek translation of the Bible today, the New Testament today, and or English. If you read the Canterbury Tales in its original language, Middle English, it would be different from the English of Shakespeare's time, much less our English. So, but this is important for Muslims. The idea of being able to memorize and recite, and this goes to the heart of the question whether or not Muhammad could read, and whether or not that's an example of the Quran being divinely inspired, but or divinely created. In either case, I don't think the Quran you can. I don't think you can make a persuasive argument that the Quran is evidence of divine intent, regardless of whether or not Muhammad could actually read. But there is a belief that it simply referred to the Arabic culture at large, which was pre-literate. Uh, So the first 5 verses here of Al Alaq, and this is the first surah that was supposedly revealed to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. And the process was Jibril would squeeze Muhammad and tell him to recite, and he would not be able to recite, so he would squeeze him again. And eventually he came up with these first 5 verses. And then subsequent to that, at a different period, at the cave of Hira, at the cave of Hira, he would come up with the future verses, and you can tell the difference between the two just by reading them, that they were composed at different times. Yeah, recitation. Let me see if I can. Okay, my Quran is in several different pieces, so um, yeah. But yeah, recitation is extremely important. Hi, Love and Light. So this is the first 5 verses. These are the first 5 verses that were supposedly revealed to Muhammad. Read in the name of the Lord who created. So yeah, recite. He created man from a clot, and the clot here is clay. And again, Muhammad is very confused as to what man was created from, whether it's clay or water or blood or dust, as it says in the Bible in Genesis. Read, read, and your Lord is most honorable, who taught to write with the pen. So here is the crux of the issue, whether or not this is an example of Muhammad being divinely guided. The fact that he's illiterate and yet he can still write. Taught man what he knew not. And here, these are the first 5 verses, and then it continues. Nay, man is most surely inordinate, because he sees himself free from want. Surely to your Lord is the return. Have you seen him who forbids a servant when he prays? Have you considered if he were in the right way, or enjoined guarding against evil? And this is one of the issues, the fact that Muhammad's followers were supposedly prevented from praying, or they were prevented from praying and worshiping their new religion and worshiping solely Allah. But as I pointed out in the last video, this is a really misleading. It's a really misleading iteration of events. The idea that Muhammad was relentlessly persecuted, that his followers were just hounded. Eventually, he was forced to leave Mecca with his followers and make the hijra to Medina, but that was after a decade. So he was basically allowed to proselytize for a decade. And as I made the point in an earlier video, try doing that. If you're an evangelist, if you're a Christian apologist, try going to Mecca and preaching the gospel. You would be arrested. You would be arrested within, at the most, maybe at the least, maybe like 20 minutes or a half hour. You probably wouldn't be able to do it for more than a few minutes if you just started preaching and evangelizing in Arabic in the middle of Mecca. And you're technically not even allowed to do that. You can't come to Saudi Arabia as a Christian, or as a Christian apologist or an evangelist. You're simply not allowed into the country. They allowed some in as part of a group with Ravi Zacharias Ministries for the first time this past year. But normally you're not allowed to come there and try to share the gospel with the Muslims living there. So this idea that they were under some sort of horrible persecution, it's simply ridiculous. It's very misleading. And the media does this today whenever they want to portray Muslims as victimized or some sort of aggrieved group. They did this with the CAA in India, the citizenship law, where India allowed persecuted minorities in neighboring Muslim countries. For example, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains to apply for citizenship. Now, they weren't discriminating against Muslims. The fact is that these Muslims could live in these nations, whereas non Muslims could not live safely. That's why Muslims minorities weren't offered this benefit. Even the Rohingya, which they were allowed into Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a predominantly Muslim country. So the idea that Muslims were being persecuted was simply a contrivance by the media. And the Burma issue with the Rohingya is another great example. But my point is, Muhammad is simply, I wouldn't say lying, but he's simply misleading people when he's trying to portray Muslims uh, in their infancy as being persecuted. They were eventually forced to leave Mecca, but only after he had been preaching for 10 years and getting virtually no converts. He only had, I think, 2 dozen converts in this entire time before he actually started raiding and becoming a warlord and promising war booty. That's when Islam really grew as a religion. So in 13 it says, "Have you considered if he gives the lie to the truth and turns his back? Does he not know? Does he not know that Allah does see?" And this is also interesting, the idea of Allah being omniscient. It's something that's undermined by other parts of the Quran. So you have a God that's not omniscient, that is limited in some way, and yet Muslims still want us to believe that it's the true God, the living God. It doesn't make any sense. So in 15 it says, "Nay, if he desist not, we would certainly smite his forehead." So this is a passage condoning the coercive aspect of Islam, the fact that you're enjoined to coerce and demand that someone be a Muslim, and if they refuse, you can murder them, you can behead them. This is one of the chief tactics used by jihadist groups, the beheading videos. You see them using these blunt knives so that they can inflict even more pain. Islam is a really sadistic religion. It's very, when people say that Islam is not a cult, I don't think they understand what the word cult means. So where he's talking about smiting his forehead, um, this is the context of this is Abu Jahl, who was supposedly killed by two child orphans in the Battle of Badr. So you can tell this passage, this part, even though this is the earliest surah, this part was written much later, when Muhammad was actually attacking non-Muslim tribes and battling them. So this supposedly refers to Abu Jahl, who was killed by two child orphans from Medina and thrown into a well. So that's the context there. A lying, sinful forehead, then let him summon his council. We too would summon the braves of the army. So you see, it's starting to change. Muhammad is going from a somewhat passive preaching to going out and demanding that people become Muslims, otherwise they're going to be attacked and killed. So in 19 it says, this is the last verse, "Nay, obey him not and make obeisance and draw nigh to Allah." And the implicit threat there is that if you don't draw nigh to Allah, he's going to use his servants to smite you. So that was Surah 96, the Clot. Surah 97, the Majesty, is next, and then the Clear Evidence. I might combine those two. So we only have like about, at the most, like 8 videos left. There's about 8 pages left. It might even be fewer, but we'll get to that next time. Thanks everyone for joining, and be sure to share this video with as many people as you can. I'd love for Muslims to come in here and challenge what we've been discussing. Anyway, I'll see you all next time, and have a good day.